Clara Ashford threw her travel bag back into the wagon before the driver had time to set the brake. 3 weeks on a rattling train from New York, 4 days in a stagecoach that smelled of tobacco and old leather, and this was what waited at the end of it all. Not the steady, capable rancher from the letters. Not a quiet promise of a new beginning. A man standing in a doorway with a baby on his hip and 2 small girls clutching his legs, watching her with dark, unreadable eyes, like she was the one who didn't belong here. If this story already has you gripping your seat, don't go anywhere, because what happens next between Clara and Silas is going to change everything you think you know about love, sacrifice, and what it truly means to call somewhere home. Hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The wagon rolled away before Clara could change her mind a second time. She stood in the dust of Sagebrush Hollow's main street with her leather travel bag at her feet and a hat box she now felt profoundly ridiculous carrying, watching the driver tip his hat without a word and flick the reins. The sound of the wheels fading down the packed dirt road was the loneliest sound she had ever heard. Lonelier than the click of her mother's bedroom door after an argument. Lonelier than the silence that had settled over her father's study the morning after he died. She turned back toward the house. The man in the doorway hadn't moved. He was taller than she'd expected. The letters hadn't mentioned that. They hadn't mentioned the way he filled the frame of the door, one broad shoulder resting against the wood. A child settled against his hip with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years. The baby, a boy, she thought, though she couldn't be certain from this distance, had a fistful of the man's shirt in one hand and was watching her with the same quiet, measuring stillness as his father. 2 girls stood at the man's knees. One was perhaps 7 or 8 with dark braids and her father's serious eyes. The other was no more than 4, pressing her face into the man's thigh, peeking out in intervals like a small animal deciding whether or not to trust the weather. Clara picked up her bag. She walked toward the door because there was nowhere else to go. When she was close enough to see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the man straightened. He wasn't wearing a coat. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. There was a smear of axle grease along the inside of his forearm that he hadn't bothered to clean. "Miss Ashford," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, unhurried. "Mr. Drifter," she said. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Not rudely exactly, more the way a man looks at the sky when he's trying to read the weather and isn't quite sure what he's seeing. "You're smaller than I pictured," he said finally. Clara blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Not an insult. He shifted the boy to his other hip. "Just an observation." She looked at the children. The older girl was still watching her with that careful, measuring gaze. The younger one had tucked herself more completely behind her father's leg. The boy on his hip made a soft sound, not distress, just the idle commentary of a child processing a new face, and reached out one hand toward her hat. Clara took a slight step back, which she immediately regretted. Silas Drifter noticed. She could tell because something shifted in his expression, not quite a flinch, but close, and he adjusted his grip on the boy without looking down. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put some coffee on." "That would be lovely," Clara said, which was the most dishonest thing she had said in months, because nothing about this moment felt lovely. She followed him through the door. The house was clean. She noticed that first, and it surprised her. She didn't know what she had been expecting, chaos perhaps, or the particular clutter of a man left alone with children for too long, but the main room was orderly. Spare, certainly. The furniture was plain and well used, and the curtains were simple calico faded from washing. But there was no mess. The children's shoes were paired by the door. A tin cup had been left on the table, but it was the only thing out of place. Whoever kept this house kept it with intention. She set her bag down near the door. The older girl had followed them inside and stationed herself at the edge of the room, arms crossed, watching Clara with an expression that was equal parts wariness and curiosity. "What's your name?" Clara asked her. The girl didn't answer immediately. She glanced toward her father, who was at the stove, then back at Clara. "Ellie," she said finally. "Eleanor, but Papa calls me Ellie." That's a very pretty name. Ellie looked unimpressed by this information. What's yours? She asked. Clara. That's a city lady name, Ellie said. Clara almost smiled. I suppose it is. Are you going to be our mother? The directness of it landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Clara heard Silas go still at the stove. The question wasn't hostile. Ellie's voice had been almost clinical, the way a child asks a question, when they have been wondering about it long enough that it no longer feels frightening, only necessary. Clara crouched down so she was closer to the girl's eye level. Her dress was wrong for the motion, too stiff, too many layers, but she didn't care about that right now. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I don't think either of us knows that yet. But I'm here. That's a start, isn't it? Ellie considered this with grave seriousness. Then she nodded once, apparently satisfied, and went to sit at the table. The younger girl had drifted in from somewhere and was watching Clara from behind a wooden chair. Clara caught her eye and smiled. The child buried her face in her hands, which Clara took as neither acceptance nor rejection, only shyness. That's May, Ellie said from the table without looking up. She don't talk much to strangers. And that, she pointed at the boy Silas was still carrying, is Thomas. He's only 2. He don't talk at all. Not a word yet, Silas confirmed from the stove. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table's edge near the chair closest to Clara without looking at her. Then he put Thomas down on the floor near the hearth, where the boy immediately began making his way toward a tin pot with great seriousness of purpose. Clara sat down. She wrapped both hands around the cup. The coffee was strong and a little bitter, and the best thing she had tasted since she left New York, and she allowed herself one quiet moment of gratitude for it before she said what she had been rehearsing since somewhere around Kansas. Mr. Drifter, she said, your letters didn't mention children. Silas sat down across from her. He picked up his own cup. He looked at her over the rim of it, and something passed through his expression that she couldn't fully name. Not guilt, not quite. Closer to resignation. No, he said. They didn't. May I ask why? Because I thought you wouldn't come. The honesty of it caught her off guard. She had been braced for deflection or apology or some half-constructed explanation about the limitations of letter writing and the difficulty of knowing how to say such things in ink. She had not been braced for plain truth delivered in a flat voice, with no particular emotion attached to it. You were probably right, she said. I know. So you lied. I left things out, he said. There's a difference. Not a very large one. He looked at her for a moment, then set his cup down. No, he said. Not a very large one. You're right about that. Clara glanced toward the children. Thomas had reached the tin pot and was now very contentedly banging it against the floor in a rhythm that didn't seem to bother anyone. Ellie was watching the exchange between her father and Clara with undisguised interest. May had edged slightly closer and was now behind Ellie's chair rather than the other one, which Clara chose to interpret as progress. Your wife, Clara said carefully. How long has she been gone? Silas was quiet for a moment. 3 years in October. I'm sorry. Thank you, he said, which was the end of it. Whatever else was in that grief, he had no intention of putting it on the table between them. She respected that, even if she found it difficult. And you thought, Clara said, that a woman from New York who had never once cooked her own breakfast or laundered her own dress would be able to step into this situation and... No, Silas said. I didn't think that. Then what did you think? He looked at his hands around the cup. I thought you'd be willing to learn, he said. And I thought maybe you had reasons for leaving that were bad enough that the truth of this place wouldn't scare you off. He paused. Was I wrong? Clara thought about her mother's parlor. The smell of rosewater and ambition. The sound of Arthur Pemberton's voice saying, Your mother and I have come to an agreement, as though she were a parcel to be inventoried and delivered, as though her own thoughts about the matter were a mild weather inconvenience that would shortly pass. She thought about the letter she had written and left on her mother's writing desk, and the train platform, and the particular sharp freedom of watching the New York skyline shrink behind her until it disappeared. "No," she said. "You weren't wrong about that." Something shifted in Silas's face, not relief exactly, but a loosening of something that had been held tight. He picked up his cup again, drank, set it down. "I can show you your room," he said. "You'll have your own. It's small, but it's private." "That's fine." The children sleep down the hall. Ellie's good about Thomas in the night, but sometimes May. "I can hear you," Ellie said from the table. "I know you can," her father said without changing his tone. "Sometimes May wakes up and needs someone to sit with her till she goes back down. I'll handle that. It's not your responsibility." "Of course," Clara said, and then surprised herself by adding, "though I don't mind if I can help." Silas looked at her. "We'll see," he said. The room he showed her was at the back of the house. It was small as promised, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand, a single window that faced the rear of the property. There was a hook on the back of the door and a small braided rug on the floor that looked handmade. The colors faded to a soft harmony of rust and cream. "I'll get a lamp in here before dark," he said from the doorway. "Thank you." He didn't leave immediately. He stood there a moment with his hand on the doorframe, and Clara could feel him deciding something, whether to say more, she supposed, or perhaps whether to say anything at all. Silas Drifter, she was already beginning to understand, was not a man who spoke carelessly or often. "I know this isn't what you pictured," he said finally. "I know it's a long way from New York." "Yes." "I won't ask you to pretend otherwise." She turned to face him. "That's considerate of you. I'm trying to be straight with you. Figure we've both had enough of the other thing." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not an easy man to live with. I work long hours, and I don't talk much, and the farm doesn't leave room for a lot of—" He stopped, started again. "What I mean is, I won't be entertaining company. I work hard, and I expect the same, and the children—" His voice changed just slightly on that word. "The children are the thing that matters. Everything else comes after." Clara held his gaze. "I understand." "Do you?" "I understand what you're telling me," she said. "Whether I understand it fully, I suppose we'll find out." He nodded. It seemed to be enough. He left her there with her bag and her hat box, and the strange, still quiet of the back room, and she listened to his footsteps, move down the hall, heard the low murmur of his voice as he said something to Ellie, heard Thomas bang the pot twice more, and then go silent. She sat on the edge of the bed. The quilt was soft under her hands. The window let in a slice of late afternoon light that turned the dust in the air to gold. Somewhere outside, something moved, a horse shifting in a stall, she thought, or the wind in whatever scrub brush grew along the fence line. She had left a house with 14 rooms, and a mother who never asked what she wanted, only what she intended to do about it. She had left a man she was 3 weeks away from marrying, a man who wore his wealth like a second skin, and had never once looked at her like she was a person rather than an acquisition. She had left dinner parties and calling cards, and the particular suffocation of being admired without being known. And she had arrived here. She pressed her hands flat against the quilt and breathed. This was real. Whatever it was, whatever it would become, it was real. The coffee had been real. Ellie's direct, unsparing eyes had been real. Thomas banging the pot against the floor with perfect, uncomplicated joy had been real. Even Silas's flat, careful honesty, which had unsettled her in ways she couldn't yet articulate, had been real. Her mother would be horrified. The thought brought Clara something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was close enough to it. She unpacked her bag, slowly, hanging her one practical dress on the hook behind the door, setting her few personal items on the washstand. She had brought almost nothing. That had been intentional. She had left the silk gowns and the ivory hair combs and the pearl earrings that had been her grandmother's in a trunk in her bedroom on Fifth Avenue, because she had understood, standing in that room, with the letter to her mother already written, and the train ticket already in her coat pocket, that she was not going where those things could follow. She heard the children's voices moving through the house. Ellie's clear and decided. May's softer and less frequent. Thomas making a sound that was somewhere between a question and a declaration. She heard Silas's voice low and even answering something. She stood up. She straightened her skirt, which was wrinkled from days of travel and would need washing. Then she went back out into the main room because sitting alone in a back bedroom feeling the weight of her choice was not something she was willing to do for long. That was not how she intended to live here. Silas was at the table, helping Ellie with something, a torn hem on a small dress. She realized the needle awkward in his large, calloused fingers. He was trying. That much was evident. He was not good at it, but he was trying, and there was something in the sight of him bent over that small garment, with the same concentration he probably gave to fence posts and axle repair, that stopped Clara where she stood. "Give it here," she said. He looked up. "I can sew," she said. "It's the one domestic skill my mother actually managed to teach me before she gave up on that and moved on to etiquette." She came to the table and held out her hand. "Give it here, Mr. Drifter." He looked at her for a moment, then passed her the dress and the needle without argument. Ellie watched Clara thread the needle with practiced efficiency. "You're fast at that," she said. "I've had practice." Clara drew the first stitch through the hem. "When I was about your age, I used to sneak down to the seamstress's room in our house and watch her work. She taught me when my mother wasn't looking. Why did it have to be secret? Because my mother thought needlework was beneath a lady of my station." Clara made 3 more neat stitches. "Which is an extremely foolish idea if you ask me." Ellie appeared to agree with this assessment. She propped her chin in her hands and watched. May had appeared from somewhere and was hovering at the edge of the table, her thumb at the corner of her mouth, eyeing the needle's movement with focus. "May," Silas said quietly. The girl looked at him. "Why don't you sit down?" She climbed up onto the bench beside Ellie, without being told twice. She didn't look at Clara exactly, but she stopped retreating. Thomas, from his position on the floor near the hearth, had abandoned the tin pot in favor of a carved wooden horse that he was walking in a slow, determined circle, narrating its journey in sounds that had no words but carried clear intention. "How old is he?" Clara asked. 2.5, Silas said. "He'll be 3 come November. And May, 5 next month. And Ellie, I'm 8. Ellie said in a tone that suggested she was old enough to speak for herself on the matter of her own age. "Of course," Clara said. She tied off the last stitch and bit the thread and held the dress up. The repair was neat and nearly invisible. She set it on the table. "There." Ellie picked it up and examined it with the critical eye of someone who had seen a lot of poor repairs. Then she nodded. "That's good," she said. "Thank you." Silas was watching her from across the table. When she looked up, he didn't look away. There was something different in his expression now than there had been in the doorway earlier. Less calculation, more something else that she didn't have a word for yet. "Supper won't be fancy," he said. "I've got salt pork and beans. Cornbread if you want to make it. I've got the meal." "I can try," she said. "Fair warning, my cooking is considerably less accomplished than my sewing." "That's all right," Ellie said seriously. "Papa's cornbread comes out like rocks." "Eleanor," Silas said. "It does, Papa." "It ain't that bad." Ellie looked at Clara with an expression that communicated clearly and without malice that it was in fact that bad. Clara pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. She moved toward the stove, and Silas moved out of her way, and for a moment they were close. The kitchen was small, and there was no avoiding it, and she felt the particular charged stillness of 2 people who do not know each other yet, but are learning how much space the other one takes up. "Meal's in the top cabinet," he said. "Thank you." He stepped back. She found the meal. She found a mixing bowl. She worked carefully and without speaking, and the kitchen fell into a comfortable sort of silence that was different from the silence they'd had earlier. Not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of people who are simply for the moment in the same room and breathing the same air and not requiring anything further from each other. Outside, the sun was going down over the ridge. The light through the window above the stove turned everything amber. Ellie had begun telling May something in a low voice, a story, or a report Clara wasn't sure which. May listened with her chin still resting on the table, and her eyes very round. Thomas had fallen asleep on the floor near the hearth, the wooden horse still clutched in both hands, his small chest rising and falling with the deep, untroubled rhythm of a child who has never once in his short life doubted that he was safe and loved, and that whoever watched over him in the night would still be there in the morning. Clara looked at him for a moment, then she turned back to the stove. She was here. She was going to make the cornbread. She was going to sit down to supper with a silent cowboy and his 3 children. And she was going to figure out one day at a time what kind of woman she was in a place like this, whether she had enough in her that was not silk and etiquette, and her mother's ambition enough that was something harder and simpler and true. She didn't know yet, but she was going to find out. The cornbread came out lopsided and a little too dark on one side, and nobody said a word about it. Ellie ate 2 pieces. May ate one, slowly pulling it apart with her fingers, the way small children do when they're more interested in the architecture of a thing than its taste. Thomas, who had woken from his floor nap with the wooden horse still in his fist, and a crease on his cheek from the rug, mostly moved his beans around the bowl, and eventually fell asleep in his chair with his chin dropping toward the table, and Silas caught him before he went over. "I'll put him down," Silas said, and lifted the boy against his shoulder with that same easy practiced motion, the motion of a man who had been the only set of arms available for a long time. Clara started clearing the table. She didn't ask. She just did it because the table needed clearing, and she was sitting at it, and she had 2 working hands, and because sitting still while someone else moved felt wrong to her in ways she had only recently begun to name. Ellie watched her stack the bowls. "You don't have to do that," the girl said. "I know. Papa usually does it." "Then he can do it tomorrow," Clara said. "Tonight I'll do it." Ellie considered this logic apparently found it acceptable, and carried her own bowl to the wash basin without being asked. Clara noticed but didn't comment. She was learning already that Ellie didn't respond well to being praised for things she considered obvious. She was 8 years old, and she had been running this household in every way a child of 8 could run a household, and she knew her own competence. What she didn't know yet, Clara suspected, was what to do with someone else who was competent too. May appeared at Clara's elbow, with her bowl held out in both hands, solemn as a church offering. "Thank you, May," Clara said. May looked at her for a long moment. Then she went and sat back down on the bench and watched the rest of the cleanup with the focused attention of a child cataloging new information. Silas came back without Thomas. He stopped in the doorway of the main room, saw the cleared table and the stacked dishes in the basin, and said nothing. He picked up a cloth from the nail beside the stove and started washing. They worked without talking. Clara dried. Silas washed. The sound of the water and the clink of tin against tin filled the kitchen, and it wasn't comfortable exactly, not yet, but it wasn't hostile either. It was simply 2 people in a small space figuring out how not to get in each other's way. When they were done, Silas put out the kitchen lamp, and May appeared from the bench and took her father's hand, and Clara was left standing in the dimmer light of the main room, listening to his footsteps, and the smaller ones beside them, move down the hall. She heard the low sound of his voice, not words, just tone, and after a few minutes, quiet. She sat in the chair nearest the window. Outside, it was full dark, and the sky was enormous. More stars than she had ever seen from a window in New York, where the gas lamps ate the dark and gave nothing back. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected to be moved by it. But she sat there in Silas Drifter's front room, with her hands in her lap, looking at that sky, and felt something shift in her chest that she couldn't immediately account for. She was still sitting there when he came back. He stopped when he saw her. Not startled, more the careful, controlled stillness of a man who had trained himself not to react quickly to unexpected things. "Thought you'd gone to bed," he said. "Not yet." He came into the room and sat in the other chair. He didn't offer conversation, but he didn't leave either, and Clara took that as a kind of permission. "How long have you been doing this alone?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Since Ellen died. 3 years, like I said. Without help. Had some at the start. Neighbor woman came by a few months after, but she had her own to look after. He folded his hands. Ellie picked up a lot of it. She's 8. I know how old she is. It wasn't sharp. He wasn't a sharp-toned man she was beginning to understand, but it was firm. Clara didn't push. She sat with it instead. That knowledge of an 8-year-old girl quietly carrying what no 8-year-old should have to carry. And she thought about the way Ellie had brought her bowl to the basin without being asked, the way she'd checked her father's face before she answered questions, the way she'd gone to stand beside May in the night, rather than call out all the invisible work of a child who has learned that the adults around her need managing. I want to be useful here, Clara said. I know you didn't bring me here for company. I know what you need. Do you? You need someone to help with the children in the household. I understand that. He looked at her. In the dark, his eyes were unreadable, but she felt the quality of his attention steady and unrelenting. That's part of it, he said. What's the other part? He was quiet again. The particular quiet of a man choosing his words the way another man might choose which board to step on. Crossing a rotting bridge one at a time, with full weight behind each one. This is a working ranch, he said. It's not a big one. But it keeps us fed, and it's mine, and I intend to keep it that way. I need someone I can build something with, not someone who's going to wait out the winter and take the first eastbound stage come spring. Clara looked at him steadily. I didn't come this far to leave in spring. People say things. I know they do. She held his gaze. I left my mother's house on a Tuesday morning while she was at her prayer circle, because I knew if I told her to her face, she would find a way to stop me. I left a man I was 3 weeks from marrying who had never once asked me a single question about what I wanted. I got on a train with one bag and enough money to get to Kansas before I'd have to wire for more, and I rode the rest of the way on a prayer and the written word of a man I'd never met. She paused. Does that sound like someone who gives up easily? Silas Drifter looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. It doesn't. Then believe me when I tell you I'm not going anywhere. He picked up the coffee cup he'd apparently brought in from the kitchen and drank from it. And Clara had the feeling that the conversation had just cleared some kind of threshold, moved from negotiation to something else. What that something else was, she couldn't say yet. But it felt different than before. Ellie's going to test you, he said. She's been the woman of this house in her own mind for 2 years. She won't say so, but she will. I expect so. Don't fight her for it, he said. Just... He stopped, looked at his hands. She needs to know she's still needed, that's all. She's scared of being replaced. Clara felt something tighten in her throat. She told you that she didn't have to. The morning came earlier than anything in Clara's New York life had prepared her for. She heard Thomas before she was fully awake, a bright, purposeful sound from down the hall that wasn't distress, but that also had no interest whatsoever in allowing sleep to continue. Then she heard Ellie's voice lower managing, and then nothing for a while, and then the smell of coffee hit her, and she got up. Silas was already at the stove. He'd been up for what looked like hours. His coat was gone, and his boots were already dirty, which meant he'd been out to the barn and back. He looked up when she came in and poured her a cup without being asked, and set it on the table. Sleep all right? He said. Yes, thank you. That was the entirety of that conversation. Thomas was on the floor again with the wooden horse. Ellie was at the table with a piece of bread. May was not visible, which Clara was learning was May's default state, present somewhere, watching from a position she had selected for maximum observational benefit and minimum exposure. There's bread, Ellie said. And there's the butter dish. Papa already made the bread. Thank you, Ellie. You're welcome. She said it automatically, in the tone of a child who has had manners drilled into them until they are reflexive. But there was something in the way her eyes flicked toward Clara, and then quickly away, that suggested she was paying attention to more than the bread. Clara sat down with her coffee and her bread, and she listened to the sounds of the morning. Silas moving at the stove, Thomas's running commentary on the wooden horse's journey across the floorboards, the wind outside the window, and she let herself simply be in it. Not analyzing it, not measuring it against what she'd left behind. Just being in it the way you have to be in a cold river when there's no choice but to swim all the way, or not at all. She got her first real look at the ranch in full daylight when she stepped outside after breakfast. It was bigger than she'd expected. Not grand. Nothing about Sagebrush Hollow was grand, but solid. Real. The kind of place built not for appearance, but because there were animals to shelter, and water to move, and crops to bring in, and every structure had been put up in service of that necessity with no extra inch to spare. Silas was at the fence line talking to a man she hadn't met yet. Heavy-set, gray-whiskered with a hat pulled down against the morning sun. She stayed at the door and didn't interrupt. After a moment, she heard the other man's voice carry toward her on the wind. She couldn't make out the words, only the tone, which was low and flat and not particularly friendly. She watched Silas's back, the set of his shoulders, the way he stood, and she could tell from the shape of him alone that the conversation was not a comfortable one. Then the gray-whiskered man looked toward the house. He looked at Clara. And he laughed. Not kindly. She heard it clearly enough. Whatever the laugh contained, skepticism, dismissal, something she didn't yet have the context to fully read it, landed on her like a splash of cold water, and she felt her spine go straight in a way that her mother had always called her best quality and her worst. She did not go back inside. She walked toward the fence. Silas turned when he heard her coming. Something moved across his expression, not warning exactly, not alarm. More the look of a man making a rapid calculation. "Miss Ashford," he said. "This is Gerald Hayworth. He runs the property on the east side." "Mr. Hayworth," Clara said. Hayworth looked her over with no particular effort to conceal the fact that he was doing it. He was the kind of man who had never been made to feel that looking a person over required any apology, and that certainty was built into every line of him. "City girl," he said finally. Not to her. To Silas, like she wasn't standing right there. "Mr. Hayworth," Silas said, and there was something in the way he said it. "I'm just saying what I see, Silas. No offense meant." Hayworth pushed back his hat. "You really think this is going to work out, woman like that all the way out here with 3 kids and a ranch to run?" He shook his head, the kind of head shake that has already decided the answer. "Come November, she'll be gone." Clara looked at Gerald Hayworth for a long moment. "Mr. Hayworth," she said, "I grew up in a house with 17 rooms, a staff of 9, and a mother who ran every social committee in Upper Manhattan like a military campaign. I know how to work. I know how to manage, and I came out here of my own free will because I wanted a real life, not a comfortable one." She held his gaze. "I'll still be here in November, and the November after that. With respect, sir, I don't believe you know what a woman like me is capable of." Hayworth stared at her. Then he looked at Silas. Silas said nothing. He didn't need to, but he wasn't looking at Hayworth either. He was looking at Clara, and whatever he saw, it did something to his expression that she caught the edge of before he looked away. Hayworth made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and wasn't quite a grunt, and turned and went back toward his side of the fence without further comment. Clara stood there until he was out of earshot. Then the particular cold clarity that had carried her through the last 30 seconds began to dissolve, and she felt her hands trembling, which annoyed her considerably. "You didn't have to do that," Silas said quietly. "I know. He's a neighbor. I have to work with him. I know that too." She pressed her hands flat against her skirt. "Do you want me to apologize for it?" A pause. "No," Silas said. She looked at him. He was looking out toward where Hayworth had gone, and his jaw was set, but there was something at the corner of his mouth that she was not entirely sure was not almost a smile. "Good," she said, "because I wasn't going to." She learned more in the next 5 days than she had in the previous 5 years. She learned that Thomas woke up at the same time every morning with the same cheerful indifference to whether anyone else was ready for the day to start. She learned that May communicated almost entirely through proximity. The closer she stood, the better she felt about something, and tracking May's position in any given room was like reading a small silent weather report. She learned that Ellie asked questions the way other people breathed constantly and without self-consciousness, and that the questions were almost always worth answering seriously. She learned that Silas rose before sunrise every morning, and that the only way she knew he'd come in for meals was when he appeared in the doorway and stood there for a moment, not announcing himself, just appearing, and that she was beginning to listen for that moment without quite admitting it to herself. She burned the beans on the fourth day, scorched them clear through, filled the kitchen with smoke, and stood there with the ruined pot in her hands, feeling a frustration so complete that it pressed behind her eyes like something about to crack. Ellie came and stood beside her and looked into the pot. "I can show you how to watch the fire," she said. Clara looked at her. "Papa taught me," Ellie said. "When Mama died, he had to learn too. He says the fire tells you when it's too hot, you just have to learn what it's saying." Clara set the pot down. "All right," she said. "Show me." And Ellie showed her. Stood beside her at the stove, small and precise and serious, and showed her how to read the heat, how to adjust, how to listen to what was happening instead of just waiting for the result. And Clara paid attention the way she had once paid attention to very little in her life, because the girl standing beside her had earned that attention the hard way, and it was the least Clara could give her. When the new pot of beans came out right, Ellie nodded once. "See?" she said. "I see," Clara said. And May, from her position near the table where she had been watching the whole thing with enormous gravity, came and stood very close to Clara's side. Not touching, just close. Clara did not make a fuss of it. She did not say a word. She just stood there at the stove and felt the small warm weight of the girl's presence beside her and let it be exactly what it was. On the sixth morning, Silas came in from the barn while she was still at breakfast, and he had a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not the careful stillness he usually wore. Something else compressed and tight behind his eyes. "What is it?" she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and the fact that he sat down in the middle of the morning was enough on its own to tell her something was wrong. "I got word yesterday from the bank in town," he said. "Loan on the south pasture is due end of next month. I knew it was coming. I thought I had enough put away." He put both hands flat on the table. "I don't." Clara set down her coffee cup. "How short are you?" he told her. She didn't flinch, though the number was more than she'd expected. She looked at him steadily while she thought about it, and he let her think, which she was also beginning to appreciate about him. He didn't rush her, didn't explain it further, just waited with that steady, undemanding patience that seemed to be his natural state. "I have some money," she said. "Not enough, but some. And I have a ring that Arthur Pemberton gave me that I didn't leave behind." She hesitated. "I didn't want to keep it, but I thought if I needed to, I could sell it." Silas looked at her. "I'm not taking your ring," he said. "It's not my ring. It was a ring someone gave me to make me into something I didn't want to be." She looked back at him. "I'd rather it built something real." The silence between them was different from any of the silences they'd had before. It was the silence of a line being crossed, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but crossed all the same in the way that the most important lines usually are. He looked at his hands. "I'll think on it," he said. "Think fast," she said. "End of next month isn't long." He looked up at her, and the expression on his face in that moment, unguarded in a way she'd never seen it. Something almost startled behind the steadiness made her chest go very still. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. And outside, somewhere between the barn and the fence line, something shifted in the air. A change in the wind's direction, slight and brief. Clara felt it through the window glass, the barest whisper of it, and didn't know yet that it was the first sign of what was coming. The ring sold for more than Clara expected. She didn't tell Silas how much. She told him enough, which was the number that mattered, and she watched his face go through something complicated and private when she set the bills on the table in front of him. A kind of pride that fought with itself and lost, because the mortgage on the south pasture was real, and the end of the month was real, and whatever Silas Drifter felt about accepting help from a woman he had known for less than 2 weeks was considerably less real than both of those things. "I'll pay it back," he said. "I know you will." "I mean it, Clara." It was the first time he had used her name. Not Miss Ashford, just Clara, flat and plain and somehow more serious for the lack of ceremony. She felt it land in a way she hadn't anticipated, and she kept her face steady, because she was not yet ready to examine what that meant. "I know you mean it," she said. "Now go to the bank before you talk yourself out of it." He went. He came back that afternoon looking lighter than she had seen him. Not happy exactly. Silas wasn't a man who wore happiness like that, but something relieved. Something that had been braced against impact, finally allowed to stand at ease. He came through the door and found Clara at the table with May in her lap. May's small hands wrapped around Clara's, and a picture book open between them, not being read because May wasn't reading yet, but being looked at, which was its own kind of reading, and he stopped in the doorway, the way he always did, and Clara looked up and something passed between them that neither one of them named. "Bank's squared away," he said. "Good," she said. May looked up at her father. "Papa, Clara showed me the horse picture. It looks like thunder." "Does it?" Silas said. His voice had gone soft in a way Clara was learning happened around his children, and almost nowhere else. She said, "Maybe we can go see thunder tomorrow." He looked at Clara over May's head. Clara kept her expression neutral, though internally she noted that she had apparently made a commitment to visit a horse she had never met on behalf of a 4-year-old who was currently redistributing Clara's lap arrangement to better accommodate the open book. "Maybe we can," Silas said. May settled back against Clara with a satisfied sound, and Clara looked down at the small dark head against her arm and felt something move through her chest that she was not quite ready to name either. Ellie appeared from the back hallway where she had evidently been listening with the particular skill of a child who had spent 3 years paying close attention to adult conversations as a matter of survival. "If May goes to see thunder, I want to go too," she announced. "Nobody said you couldn't," Clara told her. Ellie looked at her father. "Did you fix the bank thing?" "That's not your concern," Silas said. "I heard you talking about it." "Ellie, I just want to know if we're all right." She said it directly without the deflection of a child playing at adult conversation. She said it the way she said everything, straight and clear and requiring an answer. "Are we all right, Papa?" Silas crossed the room and crouched down to her level. "We're all right," he said. "I promise you." Ellie looked at him for a moment, checking the truth of it the way she checked everything thoroughly and without embarrassment. Then she nodded and went to the kitchen, and Clara heard her putting the breadboard away, which was how Ellie dealt with things that mattered to her. She moved. She did the next necessary thing. Clara was beginning to think she liked that about her very much. The trouble with Gerald Hayworth started on a Thursday. It began as a water dispute, which in that part of the country was another way of saying it began as everything land livelihood, the ability to survive the summer. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Silas's property fed both his cattle and the south pasture, and Hayworth, who had never in Clara's brief time there struck her as a man who did things by accident, had redirected a portion of the flow upstream. Not all of it, just enough. Silas discovered it when he rode the fence line that morning, and he came back tight-jawed and quiet in the particular way that Clara now recognized as the exterior of something large being held under considerable pressure. He didn't say anything at breakfast. He ate. He drank his coffee. He answered May's question about thunder with 3 words and Ellie's question about whether she could help mend the east fence with 2. And when he pushed back from the table and picked up his hat, Clara followed him to the door. "Hayworth," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her. "I'll handle it." "I know you'll handle it. How are you going to handle it?" "By going over there and talking to him. And if talking doesn't—" "Clara." His voice was patient and final in equal measure. "I've been handling Gerald Hayworth longer than you've been in Sagebrush Hollow. Let me handle it." She stepped back. She let him go. She spent the next 3 hours doing the laundry with more force than strictly necessary, running the washboard with a focused energy that Ellie, who came to help without being asked, matched without comment. "Is Papa in a fight with Mr. Hayworth?" Ellie asked. "Your father is having a disagreement with Mr. Hayworth," Clara said. "About the water." "That's a fight." It's a negotiation. What's the difference? Clara pressed her lips together. The difference is whether anyone throws a punch. Ellie considered this. Papa won't throw a punch. I know he won't. But Mr. Hayworth might, Ellie said. He threw a punch at Mr. Daly 2 years ago over a fence post. Clara looked at her. Mrs. Brannan told me, Ellie said without apology. Mrs. Brannan tells me lots of things. She says I should know about the people around us. Mrs. Brannan sounds sensible. She's very old and she smells like lavender, and she says I'm the sharpest child in Sagebrush Hollow. Ellie wrung out a shirt with practiced efficiency. I think she's probably right. I think she probably is, Clara agreed. Silas came back 2 hours later without having thrown a punch or received one, but with the expression of a man who had held himself back from both by a narrower margin than he was comfortable with. He said Hayworth had agreed to restore the water flow. He said it the way you say something when you believe the words are technically true, but doubt their practical application. He was right to doubt. By Saturday morning, the flow was restricted again worse than before. Silas rode out before Clara had finished her first cup of coffee, and this time he didn't tell her where he was going. He didn't need to. She stood at the door and watched him go and felt the first cold edge of something that was more than a water dispute. Hayworth wasn't redirecting water because he needed it. He had his own well and his own creek access, she'd seen it. He was doing it because he was the kind of man who used what he had, and what he had was proximity and history, and the kind of stubborn territorial certainty that had nothing to do with thirst and everything to do with power. He was doing it because he thought Silas was vulnerable. And Silas was vulnerable. A single father with a new wife who'd arrived with a city dress and soft hands, a mortgage, barely kept 3 small children, and no family within 500 miles. Hayworth had done the math, and he'd liked the answer. What Hayworth had not calculated was Clara. She put on her coat. She told Ellie, who was watching from the table with May pressed against her side, that she would be back shortly, and that Thomas was asleep in his crib, and not to let him climb out on his own, because last time he had miscalculated the distance considerably. "Where are you going?" Ellie asked. "To have a conversation," Clara said. "With Mr. Hayworth." "With Mrs. Hayworth," Clara said. "If there is one." There was. Her name was Dora, and she was a small, tired-looking woman who answered the door with flour on her hands and the expression of someone who had spent many years being surprised by very little. She looked at Clara standing on her porch in her city coat, with her chin level and her hands folded, and she said, "You're Silas Drifter's wife." "I am," Clara said. "May I come in?" She sat with Dora Hayworth for 45 minutes. She drank bad coffee, and she was honest, which was the only way she knew how to be when something mattered, and she told Dora plainly what the water restriction meant, not to Silas's pride, not to his stubbornness, but to his cattle and his children's winter. She didn't plead. She didn't threaten. She simply made it plain, and then she sat in the silence that followed and let Dora Hayworth do what she would do with the truth. Dora refilled her cup and said, "He doesn't listen to me." "Most men don't listen to their wives," Clara said. "Right up until they do." Dora looked at her. Something shifted in the tired lines of her face. "You're not what I expected," she said. "No," Clara agreed. "I'm not what anyone expected." She didn't know if it worked. She walked back to the Drifter property, not knowing which was its own kind of discipline. The discipline of doing what you could with what you had, and then releasing the result. Silas was in the barn when she got back. She could hear him, the particular sounds of a man working off anger through his hands, the sharp, efficient movements, the silence between them that was too controlled to be calm. She went in. He looked up from what he was doing. "Where did you go?" "To speak to Dora Hayworth." The silence that followed was the loudest she'd heard from him. "Clara," he said finally, "I didn't threaten her. I didn't insult her husband. I told her the truth about what the water means for your cattle and your children, and I had coffee with her and I left." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to watch you get ground down by a man who only has power because nobody's pushed back." That's not how I'm built, Silas. I'm sorry if that's inconvenient. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, It's not inconvenient. She waited. He stopped. Something moved across his face that he caught before it could land, pulled back behind the usual steadiness. Thank you, he said. Flat and plain, like her name the first time he'd used it. Like something real. The water was restored by Sunday morning, and Hayworth didn't come near the fence line for a week. The night the cattle ran, Clara was asleep. She heard it first in her sleep, a sound her mind tried to fold into something harmless. Thunder, she thought a summer storm coming in from the north, and then she was awake with her heart already ahead of her, already knowing because the sound wasn't from the sky. It was from the ground, moving. She was at the window before she was fully conscious of moving, and what she saw in the pale moonlight made her whole body go cold. The south pasture fence was down. She didn't know how. She didn't stop to figure it out. She pulled on her boots and her coat over her nightgown, and she ran into the hall, and she ran into Silas's room without knocking, because there was no time for anything as civilized as knocking. And she said, Silas, the cattle, the south fence is down. He was up before she finished the sentence. He was already at the window. She watched his face process what he was seeing, and she watched something come down over it. Not panic. Silas didn't panic, but a kind of cold concentration that was in its own way more frightening than panic would have been. Get the children to the front room, he said. Don't let them outside. Silas, Clara. He turned and looked at her, and his eyes were absolutely clear. Please, get the children and keep them inside. She went. She got Ellie first, who woke immediately and completely already reaching for May in the way of a child trained by years of being the one who responds first. Clara got May, who woke confused and reached for Clara with both arms, and Clara took her without thinking and carried her down the hall. She had Thomas over her shoulder by the time she reached the front room, May at her side with a fistful of Clara's coat. Ellie behind her already talking to May in a low, steady voice. It's all right. It's okay. Papa's handling it. The voice of a child who had been the calm one too many times. Clara set the children on the bed she dragged from the back room against the far wall, away from the windows. She put the lamp low. She sat down with Thomas in her lap and May against her side, and Ellie pressed against her other arm, and she listened to the sound of the cattle and the sound of Silas's voice in the dark shouting commands she couldn't make out, and she held those three children, and she did not move. Is Papa going to be okay? May whispered. Yes, Clara said, because that was the only answer available to her. Because May needed it to be true, and because Clara needed it to be true, and because the alternative was something she refused to put in the room with those children. He always handles it, Ellie said quietly. But her voice was tight in a way Clara had never heard it, and her hand found Clara's in the dark and held it, and Clara held back without saying a word. The sound outside built and built, hooves and bellowing, and Silas's voice cutting through it sharp and directing, and another voice she thought might be from the neighboring property, someone who had heard and come, and then it began gradually, and not all at once to change. To slow. To find some new order in the chaos that had been 3 minutes ago beyond containing. Thomas had his face buried in Clara's neck. His small hands were gripping her braid, not hard, just holding, and she could feel his breath warm and fast beginning to slow. May had stopped shaking. Ellie's hand was still in hers. And then the main door opened, and Silas was there, and he was breathing hard, and there was blood on his forearm, from something Clara couldn't immediately identify, a fall she thought, or the fence wire. But he was standing, and he was whole, and Ellie made a sound that was not a word, and crossed the room so fast she was in his arms before the door had swung shut behind him. He held her. He held her with one arm and held out the other toward May, who came and pressed against his side. He looked at Clara over their heads. She was still on the edge of the bed with Thomas against her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that was going to take considerably longer to settle than the cattle had. How bad? She said. Lost 3 head, he said. Could have been worse, a lot worse. Your arm. He looked down at it. Wire catch. It's not deep. Let me see it. Clara. Silas. She stood up with Thomas still on her hip. Let me see it. He let her see it. He sat down at the table, and she cleaned the gash on his forearm with water and cloth, and the children arranged themselves around them, Ellie on the bench beside her father. May between them, with her head against his shoulder. Thomas finally consenting to be put down long enough for Clara to work properly. And nobody spoke for a while. Just the sound of the water and the cloth and the lamp burning low, and the fading sound of the cattle settling somewhere in the dark outside. The fence didn't fall, Silas said quietly when she was almost done. She looked up at him. His jaw was set. His eyes were steady and cold in a way she had never seen them. Fences don't fall like that, he said. Not all at once in one section in the middle of the night. That fence was put down. The word that came up in Clara's mind was Hayworth. She didn't say it, not in front of the children. But she saw from Silas's face that he was thinking the same name, and she saw from the set of his mouth that this was not over. We'll talk tomorrow, she said. He nodded. She tied off the bandage. She smoothed it flat against his forearm, without thinking about it, the gesture automatic and quiet, and she felt his arm go very still under her hands. She let go. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the careful measuring look she'd gotten that first day. Not the flat, controlled steadiness she'd come to expect. Something else. Something that had not been there a week ago, or if it had been there, had not yet made it to the surface. Thank you, he said. Ellie was watching them both. May had closed her eyes against her father's shoulder. Thomas had gone to sleep on the floor again, the wooden horse back in both hands, as though he had reached a personal decision that the crisis was resolved and rest was now appropriate. Ellie, Clara said without looking away from Silas. Take May and get into bed. I'll come check on you in a minute. Ellie got up. She took May's hand. And at the door to the hallway she stopped and looked back at her father and then at Clara. And something moved through her face that she didn't yet have the words for. Something that was almost, Clara thought, like relief. Then she was gone. And the house was quiet. And Silas was still looking at her from across the table, and outside, in the dark of Sagebrush Hollow, something had shifted that neither of them had put there on purpose. But there it was. Neither of them slept much that night. Clara could tell from the sounds of the house the particular quality of silence that belongs to a person lying still, but not resting the way the floorboards in the hall shifted once around 3 a.m. and then again near dawn. She didn't get up. She lay in her narrow bed with her eyes open and listened to the house breathe and thought about a fence that had not fallen on its own. By the time the sky went gray, she was at the stove, and by the time it went pale gold, Silas was at the table with his bandaged forearm resting on the wood and his coffee in his other hand, and neither of them said good morning, because what was between them now was past the point where good morning covered it. Tell me about Hayworth, Clara said. Silas turned his cup on the table. What do you want to know? Everything you haven't told me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he started talking, and once he started, he didn't stop. And Clara understood that he had been carrying this for a long time without anyone to set it down in front of. Hayworth had been pressuring him for 2 years. It had started small boundary disputes, water arguments, the kind of friction that exists between neighbors in close country and can mean nothing or everything depending on the man behind it. But after Ellen died, it had shifted. Hayworth had made an offer on the South Pasture lowball and condescending, and Silas had refused, and Hayworth had not forgotten that refusal the way a man with options forgets things. He had remembered it the way a man who intends to outlast you remembers things. He wants the land, Clara said. He wants the water access the land gives him. My South Pasture sits between his east field and the creek. Silas set down his cup. Without it, he has to route his cattle half a mile further for water. In summer that matters. In drought, it matters more. And the mortgage. He knows about the mortgage. A man who's been watching your property for 2 years knows about the mortgage, Silas. His jaw tightened. Probably. So he waits, squeezes the water. Pushes until you're stressed enough and tired enough that the offer starts to look reasonable. Clara looked at him directly. And now the fence. I can't prove that. No, she said. But you know. He looked at his hands. Yeah, I know. Thomas's voice came from down the hall. The bright morning declaration of a child who has decided the day should begin, regardless of what the adults are doing about it. Clara got up. She went and got him changed. Carried him back to the kitchen where he immediately demanded to be put down, so he could locate the wooden horse which had apparently migrated under the table overnight. She sat back down. Thomas found the horse and began his morning narration. We need a plan, Clara said. Silas looked at her. Not a reaction, she said. A plan. Something that closes the space he's working in before he can make another move. She folded her hands. Who else does he do this to? What? Hayworth. Who else in this area has he pressed because men like that don't stop at one? They build a pattern. She waited. Who? Silas thought about it. Daly on the north side. Hayworth's been running cattle across Daly's east corner for 2 seasons grazing land he doesn't own. Daly's complained to the county twice, nothing came of it. He paused. And the Brannan widow. She owns 20 acres east of town. Hayworth's been after her to sell for 3 years. Mrs. Brannan, Clara said. Ellie's Mrs. Brannan. Same. Clara sat back. Something was arranging itself in her mind, the way pieces arrange themselves when you have enough of them and the patience to look at the shape they make together. She had grown up watching her mother build social and financial pressure with the quiet, relentless efficiency of a woman who understood that power is mostly about coalition. Her mother had been wrong about most things. She had not been wrong about that. I want to talk to Daly, Clara said. And Mrs. Brannan. Silas stared at her. Clara. I'm not going to do anything dramatic. I want to talk to them. Find out how bad it is on their end. If Hayworth is working 3 properties at once, there's a pattern. And if there's a pattern, there's a way to document it. She met his eyes. A county agent will ignore 1 complaint. He will have a harder time ignoring 3. Silas was quiet for a long moment. You think like a lawyer, he said finally. My father was a lawyer, she said. I grew up listening to him think out loud at the dinner table. My mother thought it was unladylike. I thought it was the most useful thing I'd ever learned. She picked up her coffee. Will you take me to Mrs. Brannan today? He took her. Mrs. Brannan was everything Ellie had suggested. Very old, very sharp, and possessed of a lavender smell so complete it seemed to emanate from the walls of her small house as much as from the woman herself. She opened the door before they knocked, which suggested she had seen them coming from the window and had simply waited for the formality of the knock to catch up with the reality of their arrival. She looked at Clara for a long moment. Then she said, So you're the one. I'm the one. Clara agreed. Come in, Mrs. Brannan said. Both of you. I'll make tea. The coffee out here is terrible and I refuse to serve it. She knew about the fence. She knew about the water. She knew about the Daly situation in more detail than Silas had, which turned out to be because Jim Daly was her late husband's nephew and told her things he didn't tell anyone else. She had been watching Gerald Hayworth operate for 4 years, and she had the patience and the memory of a woman who has learned that justice moves slowly, and the best thing you can do is be ready when it finally moves. I wrote to the county office 8 months ago, she said. I have the letter. I have their response, which said essentially nothing while using a great many words. She looked at Clara. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that 3 documented complaints filed together with specific dates and incidents from 3 separate property owners is a different thing than 3 separate complaints filed months apart, Clara said. I'm thinking a newspaper in town would find that interesting. And I'm thinking Gerald Hayworth is the kind of man who is very confident right up until the moment he realizes other people have been comparing notes. Mrs. Brannan set down her teacup. She smiled for the first time, and it was the smile of a woman who had been waiting for someone to say something like that for a very long time. Young lady, she said, I think we are going to get along very well. Silas said almost nothing on the ride back. But twice, Clara caught him looking at her from the corner of her eye, and both times he looked away, before she could read the expression fully, and she filed that away in the part of her mind that was paying attention to things she wasn't ready to address directly. The plan took shape over the next 4 days. Clara wrote the letters because she had her father's instinct for language that built argument the way you build a fence post by post, leaving no gap. Mrs. Brannan provided the documented history. Jim Daly, who turned out to be a large, soft-spoken man with a quiet fury about the grazing situation that had been building for 2 full seasons, provided 3 specific dates with witnesses. Silas provided the water diversion and the fence, and Clara made sure the fence section was described with the kind of precise, unemotional language that a county agent would not be able to dismiss as feeling. She sent the letter on a Wednesday. She sent a copy to the county agricultural office and a copy to the editor of the Sagebrush Hollow Gazette, whose name was on the masthead of a paper she had found in the bottom of the kitchen drawer. She didn't ask Silas's permission because she had already told him what she was doing, and he had looked at her for a moment and said, "All right," and that was permission enough. What she did not expect was Hayworth at the door on Friday morning. She was alone in the house. Silas had taken the children to the feed store in town, a trip that had been planned for 3 days, a trip that Hayworth, she would later think, had probably known about. She heard the knock, and she opened the door, and Hayworth was standing on the porch with his hat in his hands, and an expression she had never seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who has decided to try a different approach. "Mrs. Drifter," he said. She looked at him. "Mr. Hayworth, I'd like to talk to your husband. He isn't here. I can wait." "You won't need to," she said. "Anything you want to say to Silas, you can say to me. I'll make sure he gets the message." Hayworth looked at her, the measuring look she remembered from the first day, except now there was something different in it. Less dismissal. Something more careful. "I heard there's a letter going to the county," he said. "There is," she said. "And to the paper." "Yes." He turned his hat in his hands twice. "That's going to cause a lot of trouble," he said. "For everyone, including Silas." She looked at him without moving. "Is that a threat, Mr. Hayworth?" "It's an observation." "Your observations," she said, "tend to sound a great deal like threats. I've noticed that about them." She kept her voice level, the way her father had kept his voice level in court, not cold, not hot, simply clear. "You've been working this county for 4 years. You've pushed 3 properties, disrupted 2 water supplies, and 2 weeks ago you put down a fence in the middle of the night that nearly cost my husband his cattle and could have cost him a great deal more." She paused. "You did that because you thought we were the easiest target. A man alone stretched thin new wife from the city who didn't know anything and wouldn't last." She tilted her head slightly. "How is that assessment holding up for you?" Hayworth's jaw tightened. "I'm not your enemy," he said, and the effort the sentence cost him was audible. "Then stop acting like one," Clara said. "Restore the water permanently. Stay on your side of the fence line. Leave the Brannans and the Dalys alone." She held his gaze. "Do those 3 things, and the letter to the county stays where it is. I have no interest in trouble, Mr. Hayworth. I have an interest in my family." The word came out of her without her having planned it. My family. She felt it as she said it, the weight and rightness of it settling into her chest, and she did not take it back, because it was true. It had been becoming true for weeks each day, adding something to it, and standing here on this porch, saying it plainly to the man who had tried to take it from them, felt like the most honest thing she had said since she stepped off the stagecoach. Hayworth looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat on. "You tell Silas," he said, "that I'll think on it." "You tell me," she said, "and I'll tell him." He walked off the porch. She watched him go. Her hands were shaking again, the same way they had the day she'd faced him at the fence line, and she pressed them flat against her skirt and breathed and waited until the sound of his horse was gone before she let herself lean against the doorframe. She was still there when Silas came back with the children. He saw her face before she said a word. He handed Thomas to Ellie. "Take your brother inside. Keep May with you." And he came up the porch steps, and he looked at her with that clear, measuring gaze and said, "What happened?" She told him. He was very still while she talked. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "You talked to Hayworth," he said. "He came here. Alone. You talked to him alone. I was the only one here, Silas. I wasn't going to hide in the back room." He looked at her. "No," he said slowly. "I don't suppose you were." "Are you angry?" He was quiet again, and she watched him work through something, and whatever it was, it came out the other side of his face differently than she expected. Not anger. Not the careful, controlled neutrality she was used to. "No," he said. "I'm not angry." "Then what?" He looked at her for a long moment. And then Silas Drifter, who did not speak carelessly or often, who chose every word the way you choose footing on uncertain ground, said, "I don't know what I did to deserve you coming here." Clara went very still. "But I'm grateful," he said. "Whatever you think of me, however this ends up, I want you to know I'm grateful. Not for the fence, or the letter, or Hayworth. For—" He stopped, started again. "For being here. For staying." She looked at him. Her throat felt strange. "You thought I wouldn't," she said. "I thought you'd leave in spring," he said. "Like Hayworth said. I told you I wasn't leaving." "People say things," he said, echoing himself from weeks ago. Then he looked at her with something that was no longer the calculating, weather-reading look of a stranger. "You meant it." "I meant it," she said. He stood there on this porch, and she stood there, and neither of them moved, and the distance between them was small enough that she could hear him breathing, and he could hear her, and the sun was going down somewhere above the ridge, and the light was doing what it did out here at this hour, turning everything to something softer and more valuable than it looked at noon. "Papa." May's voice came from inside, carrying the particular urgency of a child who has located something interesting and cannot wait for an adult to come find out what it is. Silas's mouth curved. Just slightly. Just at one corner. But Clara had been watching his face for weeks now, and she knew what it meant. She felt something move in her chest that she was done pretending to herself she couldn't name. He opened the door. He held it for her, and she walked in past him close enough in the narrow doorway that her shoulder brushed his arm, and neither of them stepped aside, and neither of them said a word about it. Inside, May was holding Thomas up by his arms so he could reach the wooden horse, which had somehow gotten onto the chair, and Ellie was watching them both, with her arms crossed, and the expression of a person managing a situation she had not authorized. "Thomas threw it," Ellie said by way of explanation. "I see that," Silas said. "I didn't throw it," Thomas said, which was one of the longest sentences he had produced yet, and everyone in the room heard it. Silas looked at his son. "Did you just—" "I didn't throw it," Thomas said again, extremely clearly, and with great conviction. May let go of him in shock. He sat down on the floor and picked up the horse and went on with his business as though nothing significant had occurred. Ellie looked at her father, then at Clara. "He talked," she said. "He did," Clara said. "His first whole sentence, and it's a lie," Ellie said. "Eleanor," Silas said. But his voice was doing something it almost never did, which was breaking apart at the edges with the effort of not laughing, and Clara felt it, and pressed her lips together hard, and looked at the ceiling, and May started laughing. The pure, uncomplicated laugh of a 5-year-old who doesn't know exactly what's funny, but can feel that something is, and Ellie held on to her dignity for approximately 4 more seconds, and then lost it entirely, and Silas gave up, and laughed a real one. Full and unguarded and rare, the laugh of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to have something funny happen inside his own house, and finds it suddenly completely overwhelming. Clara looked at him. At all of them. At Thomas, sitting on the floor with his wooden horse deeply uninterested in the response his sentence had generated. She thought about New York, about the gas lamps and the 14-room house, and Arthur Pemberton's voice saying, "Your mother and I have come to an agreement." She thought about the train platform and the feeling of the city falling away behind her. She hadn't known what she was running toward. She had only known what she was running from. Now she knew. And late that night, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, and she was standing at the kitchen window with her cooling cup of coffee, she heard Silas come in from his last check on the animals and stop in the kitchen doorway, and she didn't turn around, but she heard him stand there for a moment. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe with his hat in his hand, still dusty from the barn, and he looked at her with that expression she had catalogued, but not named, the one that had appeared on his face the night of the cattle and hadn't fully left since. "About how strange it is," she said, "to end up exactly where you're supposed to be by accident." He looked at her for a long moment. "Wasn't an accident," he said quietly. "I wrote those letters for 8 months before I sent the one you answered. Threw the rest away." He turned his hat in his hands. "Something about yours felt different. The way you wrote. Like you weren't pretending." She stared at him. "You chose me specifically," she said. "Yes." "You could have told me that." "Would you have believed me?" She thought about it. "No," she admitted. "Probably not. That's why I didn't." He pushed off the doorframe. "Get some sleep, Clara. Tomorrow I want to start on the south fence, and I could use another pair of hands." He walked down the hall. She stood in the kitchen for another moment, her coffee cold in her hands, her heart doing something she had absolutely no framework for, and every intention of examining at a later time when she wasn't standing in a kitchen in her nightgown at 11 o'clock at night, having just discovered that nothing about the last 4 weeks had been as accidental as she thought. Then she put her cup down, and she went to bed. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Sagebrush Hollow, she fell asleep before she was done thinking. The letter from Clara's mother arrived on a Tuesday 3 weeks after the one to the county office. She knew it was from her mother before she opened it. She knew it the way you know certain things, without being able to explain knowing the handwriting on the envelope precise and upright, and carrying within it the particular pressure of a woman who believed that penmanship was character made visible. Clara stood at the kitchen table with the letter in both hands and didn't open it for a full minute, and then she sat down and opened it, because she was not the kind of woman who left things sealed and festering on a table. Her mother had found out. Of course she had. Clara had known eventually she would have known it the moment she chose not to write, that the silence itself would be loud enough to draw attention. Someone in New York had heard something, or the forwarding address Clara had left with the post office had done its work, or her mother had simply applied the relentless organizational intelligence that had run 14 rooms and 9 staff and every charitable committee in Upper Manhattan to the problem of finding her missing daughter, and had inevitably found her. The letter was 3 pages long. Clara read all of it. She sat with it when she was done, both hands flat on the table, and she let the words move through her without fighting them, the disappointment, the accusations, the particular brand of maternal grief that her mother wielded like a tool, precise and aimed. Arthur Pemberton had moved on, the letter said, which was the first genuinely good news in 3 pages. The family's reputation had suffered, the letter said, which Clara thought was probably an exaggeration of the highest order. And then, on the last page, in different handwriting, that was still her mother's, but smaller, slower, the handwriting of a woman writing something she hadn't planned to write, 3 sentences that Clara read twice. "I don't understand what you were looking for. I never understood what you needed. I hope to God you found it." She was still sitting there when Ellie came in from outside. The girl stopped. She looked at Clara's face with those sharp reading eyes, and then at the pages on the table, and then back at Clara. "Bad news," she said. "No," Clara said after a moment. "Just old news." She folded the pages and put them in her apron pocket. "Is your father in the barn?" "He's fixing the south fence. He said you were going to help." "I am." Clara stood up. "Do you want to come?" Ellie looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard not to show how much she wanted to say yes. "Someone has to watch Thomas," she said. "May's watching Thomas," Clara said. "And Thomas is asleep. I checked 20 minutes ago." Ellie reached for her coat. The county agent came on Thursday. His name was Mercer, and he was younger than Clara expected, which she took as either a good sign or a very bad one. And he arrived with a leather satchel and a notebook, and the careful, practiced neutrality of a man who has learned not to show which way he's leaning until he has to. He spoke to Silas first, which was how things worked, and then he asked to speak to Clara, which was not how things usually worked, and she saw Silas notice that, with something that looked like quiet satisfaction. She sat across from Mercer at the kitchen table, and she was precise, and she was factual, and she did not embellish a single thing, because she had learned from her father that embellishment was the enemy of credibility, and credibility was the only currency that lasted. She told him about the water. She told him about the fence, and the date, and the section, and the particular way a fence falls when it's helped versus when it falls on its own. She told him about the documented complaints from Mrs. Brannan and Jim Daly, which she had copies of because she kept copies of everything now. She set the copies on the table in front of him and folded her hands and waited. Mercer wrote for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up. "You were a lawyer's daughter," he said. "Yes." "It shows," he said. And for the first time his neutrality cracked just slightly at one corner, and she saw that it was cracking toward something favorable. "I'll need to ride out and look at the fence line." "Of course," she said. "Silas will take you." "And the creek diversion." "There's a photograph," she said. "Jim Daly took it with his son's camera 2 weeks ago. I have that as well." Mercer looked at the photograph. He wrote something in his notebook. He did not say anything further, but when he left he shook her hand, which he had not done when he arrived, and Clara took that as the only answer she was going to get for now. Silas walked him out. When he came back, he stood in the doorway, the familiar posture, the doorframe, the pause, and looked at her across the room. "He's going to do something," Silas said. "Yes," Clara said. "I think he is." He crossed the room. He sat down across from her. He looked at the empty table where the copies had been, and then he looked at her and she expected him to say something about Mercer or Hayworth or the fence. Instead he said, "There was a letter this morning. I saw it when I came in for water." She had forgotten about the letter. Or she had not forgotten, she had put it in her apron pocket and covered it with the morning's work. And she had thought, "Not yet, not today. Let me have the fence and Mercer and one more ordinary day before I have to deal with what my mother wrote." But there it was. There was Silas watching her with those eyes that missed almost nothing. "From my mother," she said. "You don't have to." "She knows where I am," Clara said. "She understands that I'm not coming back. She doesn't understand why." She paused. But she wrote something at the end, 3 sentences. She pulled the folded pages from her pocket, open to the last, and set it on the table, and pushed it toward him without explanation. He read it. He read it twice the way she had. He set it down. "She loves you," he said. "In the only way she knows how," Clara said, "which is not always the same as the way you need." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You going to write back?" "Eventually," she said. "When I know how." He nodded. He pushed the letter back toward her. And then he said without preamble, without the careful approach she had come to expect from a man who handled words like tools to be selected and set down precisely, "I don't want this to be an arrangement." She went very still. "What we have," he said. "I don't want it to be an arrangement. That's what I wrote in the letters. That's what I told myself I was looking for. Someone to help with the children and the household and—" He stopped, pressed both hands flat on the table. "That's not what I want anymore." Clara looked at him. "Silas," she said carefully. "I know it's fast," he said. "I know you've been here 6 weeks, and I know what people say about arrangements like ours, and I know—" He stopped again, and she could see it costing him this talking, this laying of things out in language instead of action, and she understood that it was the hardest thing he did, and he was doing it anyway. "I know I don't have any right to ask you for more than what you agreed to, but I'm asking." The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas's voice came from down the hall. "Not distress. Just the running commentary of a boy whose wooden horse was on a journey of great importance. "What are you asking exactly?" Clara said, not to make it harder for him, because she needed to hear him say it clearly in his own words, without her filling in the spaces he left. He looked at her across the table. "I'm asking if you'll stay," he said. "Not because of the children or the ranch or the mortgage or what either of us agreed to in a letter 6 months ago. I'm asking if you'll stay because you want to, because this is yours, because—" His voice went quiet and certain at once. "Because I don't want to picture this place without you in it anymore, and I haven't for a while now, and I figured you ought to know that." Clara sat with it. She thought about the train platform. She thought about the letter she'd left on her mother's writing desk, and the particular sharp freedom of watching New York disappear behind her. She thought about a narrow bed in a back room, and the smell of coffee in a strange house, and a girl asking, "Are you going to be our mother?" with the directness of a child who needs a real answer. She thought about a tin pot being banged on the floor, and a small hand finding hers in the dark, and a man carrying an 8-year-old's grief without being asked because there was no one else to carry it. She thought about the south fence, and Gerald Hayworth, and 3 pages of her mother's handwriting, and Silas's voice saying, "Wasn't an accident in a dark kitchen." She thought about who she had been in New York, and who she was becoming here, and that the woman she was becoming here was someone she actually wanted to be. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "You've said that before. And I've meant it every time." She held his gaze. "I mean it differently now." He looked at her. Something moved through his face, slow and unmistakable. "How differently?" he said. "Silas," she said, and her voice was very steady. "Ask me something real." He was quiet for a moment that lasted a long time. Then he said, "Will you be my wife? Not the arrangement, not the letters. My wife." "Yes," she said. Just that. One word, flat and plain and carrying everything the way his words always did. And she thought that she had learned that from him without meaning to, the understanding that the most important things don't need dressing up. They just need saying true. The celebration, such as it was, happened on a Saturday, and it was nothing like what Clara had imagined celebrations looked like 6 weeks ago, which meant it was nothing like the formal dinners and the string quartets and the receiving lines of her mother's world. And it was everything she had not known she wanted. Mrs. Brannan came first at 8 in the morning with a pie and the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this occasion with considerably more patience than she found comfortable. Jim Daly came with his wife and his 2 sons, one of whom was nearly grown, and the other of whom was immediately recruited by Ellie into a project whose nature Clara didn't fully determine, but that seemed to involve the back fence and a considerable amount of rope. 3 other families from surrounding properties arrived through the morning, people Clara had met only briefly at the feed store, or not at all, people who had heard something and decided that hearing something was sufficient reason to show up with food and help and the particular loud warmth of a community that knows how to gather around something worth gathering around. Hayworth did not come. Clara did not expect him to. But she heard from Mrs. Brannan, who heard from someone who heard from someone, that Mercer the county agent had visited Hayworth's property on Friday, and that the visit had been long, and the agent's expression afterward had been the expression of a man who has told someone something they would not enjoy hearing. That was enough for now. It was not justice yet, but it was the shape of justice beginning, and Clara had learned from her father that the shape of it coming was sometimes more powerful than the thing itself, because it changed what a man believed was possible. The children were everywhere. Thomas had attached himself to Jim Daly's younger son Robbie, who was 6 and apparently willing to follow Thomas's wooden horse narration with the seriousness it deserved. May had come out of herself in a way that still surprised Clara every time it happened, standing close to Mrs. Brannan, who had apparently decided that May was the most interesting child in the county, and was currently telling her something that made May's eyes go very wide and then very bright. And Ellie was in the thick of everything, managing, organizing, redirecting the girl who had run this household in every way she could, and was now slowly, carefully, with the caution of someone who has been the only one for too long, beginning to let herself simply be a child within it. Clara watched her from across the yard. She watched her laugh at something the Daily Boy said. A real laugh, unguarded the laugh of an 8-year-old who has put something down she'd been carrying and found that her arms freed could do other things. She felt Silas come and stand beside her. She didn't look at him. She looked at Ellie. "She's going to be all right," Clara said. "Yeah," Silas said. "She is. She's been all right for a long time," Clara said. "But now she gets to be something else too." He was quiet for a moment. "What's that?" "Just a child," Clara said. "For a little while. She gets to just be a child." She felt his hand find hers at her side. He didn't make a production of it. He simply took her hand the way a man does something he has decided to stop talking himself out of, and held it, and she turned her palm up to meet his and held back. Mrs. Brannan caught her eye from across the yard and smiled the smile of a woman who has been waiting for this particular development and feels entirely vindicated by its arrival. Clara looked away before she smiled back. She was fairly certain she failed. The letter to her mother, when Clara finally wrote it, was not 3 pages. It was 1. She wrote it at the kitchen table 2 nights after the gathering, with the house quiet around her, and the lamp turned low, and the particular late-night stillness that she had come to think of as the best time in the house. The time when everything was settled, and the day was accounted for, and tomorrow was still only a shape. Nothing specific, nothing requiring immediate management. She told her mother the truth. Not all of it. Some things were too new and too real to put in a letter, but enough. She told her there were 3 children. She told her their names and their ages, and the things that made them who they were. She told her that Silas was a quiet man who chose his words carefully and meant every one of them. She told her that the house was small, and the work was hard, and that she had burned a pot of beans so badly that an 8-year-old had to teach her how to manage a fire. And then she wrote in the last paragraph in handwriting that was her own, not her mother's, not borrowed from anyone else, her own. "I found it, Mama. I don't think I can explain it in a way that will make sense to you, and that's all right. But I found it. I'm home." She sealed the envelope. She set it on the table for the morning post. She sat for a moment in the quiet. Down the hall she heard Thomas shift in his sleep and say something that wasn't a word, but carried the tone of absolute contentment. The sound of a child deep in a dream where everything is fine. She heard May's breathing from behind the door, slow and even. She heard Ellie's silence, which was a different kind of sound than all the others. The silence of a girl who had finally, at 8 years old, stopped keeping watch. And she heard from the end of the hall the creak of a floorboard that told her Silas was awake. She didn't move. After a moment she heard his door open, his footsteps in the hall unhurried. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, barefoot hair unruly in the way it only was this late, and he looked at her at the table, and she looked at him in the doorway, and he said, "You're still up." "I was writing to my mother." He looked at the envelope on the table. "You tell her the truth. Enough of it." He came in. He sat down across from her. He didn't take her hand this time. He looked at the letter, and then at her, and his expression in the lamplight was the most open she had ever seen it, stripped of the careful management he wore through the days like a second coat. "You happy?" he said. Clara looked at him. She thought about everything she had given up, and everything she had found, and the particular arithmetic of a life that doesn't add up the way you expect it to, but adds up in the end to something truer than the sum you'd planned for. "Yes," she said. "Are you—" He reached across the table and picked up her hand again. "More than I know how to say," he said. "You said enough," she told him. He looked at their hands on the table. He looked up at her. And that thing she had catalogued and named and stopped pretending not to know was right there in his face, plain and steady and real. The kind of thing that doesn't need the right words, because it has already decided to be permanent. Sagebrush Hollow was not a grand place. It would not appear on the kind of maps Clara's mother decorated her walls with. The house was small, and the winters were hard, and there would be more burned beans, and difficult neighbors, and dry seasons, and nights when the weight of running something real, pressed down like the sky, had lowered itself onto the roof. But she was here. She had chosen this with both hands open, eyes clear, and she had not been wrong. Silas Drifter had written 8 letters before he wrote the one she answered. He had picked her specifically from a woman who wrote like she wasn't pretending. And she had come out here to find a life, and she had found one, not the one she had imagined on the train, not the one her mother had planned, not the one anyone who had watched her leave New York would have predicted. Something better than all of them. Something with flour on her hands and 3 children down the hall, and a man across the table who meant every word he said. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she knew it the way you know things that don't require explanation, that don't ask to be justified, that simply are the way the land out here, simply is old and wide and unapologetic, with more sky than she had ever seen in her life, pressing down on it every day, and the stars at night so thick and clear and close, that you could spend a whole lifetime looking and still not see all the way to the end of them. This was her life. She had built it piece by ordinary piece from a train ticket and 1 leather bag, and the refusal to be anyone other than herself, and it was in every way that mattered exactly enough.